All right. So we have a guest speaker today, but he's not really a guest. He's been a member of our church, and he was our youth and young adult pastor until God called him to Christian Challenge full time and helping to start a ministry around Grand Canyon University, hopefully on Grand Canyon University. So our church supports him financially. And so I'm going to have Derek come on up. Derek is active at Christian Challenge. We have a Christian Challenge here at Mojave Community College that Derek helped launch prior to him being called full-time into Christian Challenge ministry. And so I asked him to come and share with us all that God has been doing since his last time that he was here. And then just to give us a word of encouragement, to let us know that that young adult and youth area that we're working on revising in our church is an area that we need to pour into because they are not the future of the church, they are the church. And if we keep thinking they're the future, then we will dismiss them, but they are the church now. And we got to be able to continue to invest and work on strategizing some things. So I asked Derek to come and just give us a word of encouragement. And so here's my brother.
Thanks, John. Good morning. As John said, my name is Derek Craigler. I was the youth and young adult pastor here for a little over 2 years. And a couple of years ago, my wife and I just felt a calling to step away from this church. We really couldn't give a particular reason why. It was more of just a feeling. And we joke that we know that God's talking to us when we're both on the same page and we actually haven't talked to each other. Because I remember one Sunday I came home and I said, Danny, I think we're supposed to leave. And she said, that's weird because I've been feeling the same thing. And so I did, what we might assume is the logical thing of trying to find another position at a church. And so I applied to about 10 different churches all over the country. And my time here had taught me that, I loved my youth kids. I loved working with the youth, but my heart and the calling that God was calling for me was to work with the college kids, young adults. And so I started applying at different college pastor positions, and they all said no. And, I was not disheartened by it because it's pretty easy to know that God doesn't want you somewhere if they don't offer you the job. And so I just said, okay. And my wife actually came to me and she said, well, what about Christian Challenge? And Christian Challenge was a ministry that we had been involved with here. We had actually, I had been running it on Mojave Community College. And I said, I don't know. The churches are nice. You have the stable salary coming in. If you work for Christian Challenge, you have to raise support. You have to, go out and ask people to donate to your ministry. And she was on the same page at first, but when she came back with what about Christian Challenge, my first words were, who are you and what have you done with my wife? But then she said something. She said, God's really been working on my faith and my trust. And I think Christian Challenge is where we're supposed to be. And I had one job interview left. I said, okay, it was for a church in Illinois. And I said, all right, I got one interview left. If they say no, Challenge is it. Well, they said no. And so we had the exact opposite reaction with Challenge that we had with all these churches. With these churches, I was applying, and they were constantly telling me, no, thank you. We appreciate you applying. When I talked to the regional catalyst, the guy who oversees the Phoenix area, I said, hey, we're thinking about maybe coming to Challenge. He said, where do you want to live? I said, excuse me? He said, where do you want to live? I will find you a school. You just tell me where you want to live. And so through God's direction, through a lot of prayer, we felt called to go to Grand Canyon University. And so I'm not affiliated with the school. I work for Christian Challenge, the ministry. We have their permission to be on campus. And it's been amazing. It's kind of surreal because a year ago, I stood on this stage, almost exactly a year ago, and I got to tell you guys, the longer version of God calling us away. And now it's almost like part 2. Now where I was here telling you about, hey, this is what we think is going to happen. Now I've got to have an amazing year getting to serve. Dang it, I'm already getting emotional. I will do my best not to get emotional. There are only 3 things that really get me emotional: the gospel, my family, and my students. And I have to talk about all 3 today. So I will do my best, but we shall see. So, what is Christian Challenge? So the mission statement of Christian Challenge is: we exist to engage college students with the gospel, develop disciples of Jesus Christ, mobilize servant leaders for the church, and send missionaries to the world. There are 500,000 college students in Arizona. That's just Arizona. There are 50 college or university campuses. Right now, we're on 17 of them. Our goal is to eventually get on all 50. And this mission statement, it's such a good mission statement. I love it because it's a natural progression that we see of someone growing in the faith, someone getting the gospel at the beginning and, just getting to grow in it. So how do we do this? Well, first one, engage college students with the gospel. We train our student leaders. Right now I have 7 on GCU. I'll show you guys pictures of them later, who help me run the ministry. I oversee it, and then these are the college students that heard about our ministry and wanted to get involved. Some of them are going into ministry. Of the 7, we have 4 that are studying theology degrees, and then we have some that are going to school for film, for teaching, for IT. And it's just amazing to get to see the different characters that God has brought into our ministry, and these students and just their heart for the gospel. We teach them to engage their fellow students and take them out for coffee. Nothing crazy. They're not trying to bring them to a church service where we surprise baptize them or anything like that. They just ask them out for coffee. Hey, you want to go get coffee with me? And then we teach them how to present the gospel. One of our favorite ways of doing it is the 3 circles. I know John's very familiar with that one. He's taught classes on it here. It's a great way to share the gospel. There's many, many ways to share the gospel. But that is how we engage with those college students. We teach them to go out. We teach them to say, hey, just come hang out with me. I just want to talk to you about something. And a tactic we use, we call it your story, my story, God's story. Because we've found that most times everyone's favorite subject is themselves. And so we start with, tell me about yourself. How'd you get here? What are you studying? What was growing up like? Different things like that. And then we found that people who tell you their story are more likely to then listen to your story. And for those of us who are Christians, something that is completely, should be completely woven into our story is our testimony. It's our relationship with God. And so that transitions from, let me listen to your story. Here's what happened to me. Here's what changed my life. We do this. We do game nights on campus. One of the biggest successes we found was we found a spot on campus that has board games and ping pong tables and all sorts of stuff. And so every Thursday we go and we just hang out. It's a very low risk, easy event for our students to invite their friends to, and just say, hey, there's no Bible study, there's no prayer. We're just hanging out, and that allows us to build relationships with these students, and then hopefully lead to gospel appointments. When we're having a hard time getting gospel appointments organically, we do surveys on campus. So we'll make forms, Google Forms, and we'll put questions on there. And usually it's just one question. We walk up to students and say, hey, do you have time to take a quick survey? And sometimes they're too busy. It is what it is. But most of the times it's, yeah, no problem. What's the question? And so we always try to ask something that they really can't talk their way around. So our first one that we did was, assuming God is real, what's one question that you would ask him? And the answers that we got from this question were just super cool. We had some great discussion with some of these students. And our follow-up question after we asked the one question is always, do you want to get coffee? Do you want to hang out later to talk about this? And granted, some still try to avoid, and they don't want to sit down, and that's fine. We don't chase them down. But for those that do, we just have them fill out a little connection card, essentially, where we get their phone number, we get their name, and we can get in touch with them later. Next part of our mission statement is develop disciples. So we encourage all of our leaders and students to find a Paul and to find a Timothy. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with that vernacular, what I mean is you need someone pouring into you, and you need to be pouring into someone else. What we find a lot of times is, people who've been established in the church or people who go to church, they just think, well, Sunday's it. I'm just here to hear a message and I go home and that's it. But the true life change and the true spiritual growth and development usually happens in those mentorship roles. Whether you're having someone pour into you or you're pouring into someone else, I've learned just as much from people who have mentored me as I have from my students that I've been pouring into. And it's an amazing dynamic and it's an amazing relationship that all Christians are called to. This summer, I challenged my student leaders to find someone to disciple this upcoming semester. We start last week of August is when our semester starts up again. And some of them already have students lined up. Even though we're 2 months away, they still have them ready to go. As well as trying to develop disciples, we host Bible studies on campus. We hosted 3 different Bible studies this last semester. They're led by our student leaders. We usually line up a curriculum, whether it's something, we get off like right now, media, a book series we buy, whatever, something like that, just to give our student leaders a guide. And then we talk through it the week prior. Hey, what are you guys going to talk about? What do you think about this question? What do you think about that? And the reason this second step is so important, developing disciples, is, and I love how they break it down, The Fuel and the Flame. If you've never read this book, I highly recommend it. It's called The Fuel and the Flame. It is meant for college students, but I challenge you to read this and not feel challenged. It is an incredible book about evangelism. It breaks it down in a way that is so much better than anything I've ever heard. And in it, one of the authors, he breaks down the importance of disciple making. He says this: if a great evangelist were to win 1,000 people a day to Christ, we would all be amazed and full of praise to God. Even though we might stand on the sidelines and cheer them on, it would still take them tens of thousands of years to win the world to Christ at today's population. But suppose I led you to Christ and spent a year building deep into your life. Then we both turned around and did the same for someone else the following year. Now that there are 4 of us, we would begin this 3rd year of ministry by each finding another person to win and disciple. If the chain remained unbroken, the enormous power of multiplication would kick in, and the world would be won to Christ in an incredibly short 33 years. And so that is why we focus so heavily on developing disciples. And this ties into our next section on mobilizing servant leaders. But something that we found with other college ministries is they would go to these campuses and they would essentially start a church on campus. They would go there, they would start Bible studies, they would get the kids involved. But then when the students left the campus, they graduate, they didn't know what to do. They would leave, and then now they don't know how to get plugged into a church. They don't know how to find a good church. And they don't know what it looks like to even be a member. And so one of the things that Christian Challenge does is we partner with local churches. We do this so that we have a natural way to say, hey, I'm going to this church over here. Why don't you come join me? We do this so that we can get as many young adults involved in the church, get them plugged in, get them volunteering, so that when they graduate, many of our students are out of state. When they leave us, they're not just standing there going, I don't know how to do this. They're able to say, I know how to get plugged in with a church. I know how to volunteer. I know how to approach a pastor with a question. Our church down in Phoenix, we are hosted by First Southern Baptist Glendale. They are actually a oddity among Christian Challenge in that they actually host 3 different campuses. They host Arizona Christian University, Glendale Community College, and Grand Canyon University. And so we're in a unique situation where we have actually now 5 part-time or full-time staff members for Christian Challenge going to one church. That's pretty rare among the churches that host us. But what it's led to is something really cool. We have a ministry that we do on Friday nights called Collective. And every week we bring all 3 campuses We come in, it's like a mini worship service. They get some worship, they get a message, and then they get small group discussion afterwards. We host events, we do all sorts of stuff. And it's pretty incredible to see, because this last semester we had our biggest night, and we had 70 college students in one spot. And it was incredible to see, guys. And to give you perspective, I'm the oldest person in the room there. My students like to remind me how old I am. But yeah, it's just incredible. Everybody, between the ages of 18 to 29, we had 70 people in that room. And our last part of our mission statement is send missionaries to the world. We do this in two ways. One, for those that aren't called to full-time ministry, they're called to, what you might call normal vocations, jobs, different things like that. We train them to think of that as their mission field. Just because you're going to be a teacher doesn't mean you have any less impact as the pastor on Sunday. Just because you go to work in IT doesn't mean that you're called any less to share the gospel than the missionary on the campus. So we train our students to think like that, and to understand that them sharing the gospel doesn't end when they graduate from college. And for those who do want to be missionaries, we get them involved in programs, help them get them trained. We're heavily involved with NAM, IMB. And so, if they want to leave the country and go be a missionary, we have plenty of resources for that. But also, for those that are feeling called to college ministry, we have options for that as well. Christian Challenge has a position called an apprentice. And what that is essentially it's a part-time campus missionary who serves under the campus missionary in order to kind of get their foot in the door, learn what ministry looks like. They get a peek behind the door, and they get to help run different stuff. And right now I have two apprentices. Their names are Parker and Rachel. They are awesome. And I'm just so excited to see what God is going to do in their lives. Now, again, this mission statement follows a natural progression, but it all hinges on that first line. We exist to engage college students with the gospel. Without that, there's no foundation. There's no, step two. That is what it is. And so today I wanted to take some time to study some scripture in Luke chapter 11, if you want to turn your Bibles there. And I just want us to look at this because I think this passage does so much for explaining the power of the gospel. Luke chapter 11, starting in verse 29. As the crowds were increasing, he began to say, this is Jesus speaking, "This generation is a wicked generation. It seeks for a sign, and yet no sign will be given it but the sign of Jonah." Now, we read in Matthew 12 that the people who initiated this conversation were actually Pharisees and scribes. They were coming to Jesus and they were saying, "Hey, what's the sign we're going to be looking for? If you're really the Messiah, how are we going to know?" And it's pretty funny because we know from their intentions and from the interactions that they've had with Jesus up until this point, this is not a good question. But thankfully, as we're going to see in this passage, like he did every time that he was challenged and the Pharisees never seemed to learn their lesson, is Jesus always responded in a way that they never really expected. They always expected a straightforward answer, and Jesus always, surprising, being God, was able to outsmart them. Now, we look at this and we say, how in the world could these guys be asking for a sign? Up until, before we even get here, Jesus has already brought people back from the dead. He's healed countless, and he's fed the 5,000. And we know that these guys had to have heard about it. I mean, Kingman is not a big place. And, I don't have to tell you guys, word travels fast in a small town. And back then, even though there was no internet, there was no phones, nothing like that, all that left was just more stuff, or less stuff to talk about. So I guarantee these guys have heard about all these signs. And yet they're still coming to Jesus and they're saying, yeah, but what's the real sign? What's that thing that we really should be looking for? And in thinking about my own experience with challenge and feeling called to go down to Phoenix, my first point is this: we need to be willing to listen to God's will and not try and force our own. See, the Pharisees were coming with an objective. They wanted an answer. They wanted something they could use against Jesus. And yet, when he answered them, he said, "You will get nothing but the sign of Jonah." He answered them in a way they didn't expect. Now, the crowds that were here, the common people, if you will, they would have been expecting or wanting a different answer. And we know this from many places in Scripture. They wanted a conqueror. They were looking for somebody to come in, defeat Rome, and elevate Israel back to its former glory. And so again, when we're asking things of God, we need to be careful that we don't try to put our own will ahead of God's. When I first told people I was leaving and that I was feeling God calling me away, I had many people ask me, they said, "Well, where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, I've lived in Arizona my entire life. I would love to live somewhere green." And God called me to Phoenix, Arizona. Don't ever let anybody tell you God doesn't have a sense of humor. And so in wrestling with that, I was reminded of this point. And I also appreciate his word choice. In verse 29, he says, "This generation is a wicked generation." And every time I read this, I think of the many complaints I've heard about Gen Z. And it's one of those things, they can be easy to pick on, don't get me wrong. But there's much more to them than just what you see on the news and social media. Complaints that I've heard about Gen Z is that, they're lazy, they're entitled, they're overly sensitive, they're too opinionated, and they're addicted to technology. Now, granted, those aren't all of them, but those are the ones I've heard the most often. And if I can play the advocate for Gen Z just for a moment, I want to explain some of the unique situations that they are finding themselves in. One, they're the first generation who came in with the internet, already there, ready to go. And we're seeing so many repercussions of that. Social media is designed with similar strategies to casinos. When you get that when you get that notification, it triggers dopamine in your brain. It's that happy chemical that gives you that hit and just makes you want more. Social media companies understand this, so they treat it like little rewards. Sometimes they will actually hoard likes, notifications, and they'll hold on to them until certain times of the day when they know that people are most likely to engage with social media, and then they give them back. So even though the likes are coming in, they won't notify you about it until they can build up a supply of them so they can give you a bigger hit. One of the things that they struggle with, and it sounds like a good thing, but they actually can be anything they want to be. On the surface, it sounds like a great thing, but we found through psychology and different studies that it's actually incredibly damaging to the brain to have all of these choices. Many of them turn to social media and YouTube as a career, which, as someone who grew up before when the internet was just getting started, I never thought in a million years you could make a career posting videos on YouTube. And yet there are people, today who make millions of dollars just doing that. And they see this and they think, that's what I want to do. But what they fail to realize many times, because it's just what they've grown up with, is people don't post the worst of their life on social media. Many times I've heard it said, when you look at social media, that's somebody's highlight reel. And what we do is we compare their highlight reel to our bloopers. And it impacts us. They feel incredible pressure to be perfect. Social media has given the examples of perfect people. And in fact, it's leading to many, Gen Z, many young people actually trying to get plastic surgery to look like the filters on Instagram. these filters that change your appearance, make you look a certain way. And they go, well, why can't I look that way all the time? And so they're spending money and going to doctors to get plastic surgery to look like something that isn't real. I don't want to say many, but there's plenty of high school males now who are experimenting with steroids, experimenting with drugs that are going to affect them the rest of their lives. And now it's not even a shameful thing. I've lost track of how many times I've seen videos posted about these young men posting on TikTok or Instagram, whatever, and talking about, oh, look at me. Yeah, I'm just trying steroids for the first time. This is how it's going. This is what I'm doing. They just feel this immense pressure to be perfect, and they feel like they have to live up to it. There are fewer options for them to socialize in person, where we once had many clubs, many different organizations that were just focused on getting young people out and doing stuff. Many of those don't exist anymore. And so they're looking around and they're saying, well, I can't socialize in person, so the only way I can do it is through a phone. Many of them prefer face-to-face interaction, and psychologically it's healthier for them. But they just don't know how to do it. When the only thing you've ever done is talk to somebody over a screen, it can feel very intimidating to try and talk to somebody in person. They have access to so much information that is overwhelming, and it makes them afraid they're going to miss out on the newest thing. This and many other factors has led to only 45% of Gen Z stating that they consider themselves to have good mental health. Nearly 42% of them struggle with depression. Accidents are the number one cause of death for people between the age of 10 to 24. Suicide is number 2. I'm not here to justify anybody's actions and make them out to be saints, but I just want you guys to understand that when you go on social media, when you see the news, that does not reflect this entire generation. Everybody is accountable for what they have to do. But some of the things that I have seen from them that have just blown me away is they think outside the box. They are incredibly creative. They are raised to question everything. And so when you tell them, well, this is how we've always done it, it means very little to them. They say, well, what about this? And in all honesty, in my ministry, this has been amazing because they've come up with some ideas that I never would have come up with. Because of their increased understanding of mental health and possibly because of their own struggles, they're more empathetic and they truly do care about people. They're eager to be a part of teams and they want to work together with others. And this is probably my favorite thing about them. They are passionate about whatever they get involved in. Now, as we can see on the news, it leads to many unfortunate avenues. But thankfully, it also applies to the church. And the group that I have become involved with down in Phoenix, the young adults down there, I have never met a group of Christians, not just young adults, but a group of Christians who is so passionate about people hearing the gospel. Even this week, we have our Zoom meetings on Thursdays. Some of our guys are out of state, like I said. And so as we're preparing, we're actually going through the Fuel and the Flame right now. As we're preparing for this next semester, I got a text from one of our female leaders, and she said, hey, me and 2 others might have to dip out a little early. Okay, what's going on? And she's like, well, we met a group of girls that we're taking out for dinner tonight, and we're going to tell them about the gospel. And I said, you know what? It would have to be pretty ridiculous for me to be upset about you guys missing a meeting to go share the gospel with some people. And I said, I am so proud of you guys. Because these students don't just see this ministry as something that happens for the fall and spring semester. They see it as something that God has called them to. And again, they are so passionate about it. Getting back into our scripture here, verse 29, as the crowds were increasing, he began to say, this generation is a wicked generation. It seeks for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it but the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so will the Son of Man be to this generation. And so again, here's the here's the Pharisees asking a question. Well, what sign can we look for? And Jesus answers in a way they just don't get it. Even the crowds that were looking for that conqueror to come in and destroy Rome didn't understand. Jesus was offering them eternal salvation, but what they were looking for in that moment was a momentary rescue. He's saying, you guys don't understand what I'm bringing. I know what you want, but just wait. When Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah, he was referencing the story of Jonah and Nineveh. Most of us have probably heard the stories, heard this story. I grew up, getting it read to me as a child. And until, even preparing for the sermon, I didn't fully appreciate the story of Jonah. The quick version is this: God calls Jonah to go to Nineveh. He says, nope, hops on a ship, says, I'm going this way. I know you want me to go over there, but I'm going over there. And so he learns the hard way. It's really bad to argue with the God who controls the entire universe. And so he ends up getting thrown overboard and swallowed by a great fish. He spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. In that time, he has this come to Jesus moment where he says, okay, God, I'm sorry. I'll do what you've called me to do. And in researching this passage, it's a little bit more understandable now for Jonah's perspective. See, again, I got this story read to me as a kid, and they talk about how, okay, Nineveh was a wicked city. What does that mean? Well, as a kid, I always knew they were the bad guys because they always had, the angry eyebrows. And, that's how you knew they were the bad guys. We read this story and we think, well, why wouldn't he want to go to Nineveh? Well, Nineveh was not an Israelite city. It was one of the royal cities in the Assyrian Empire. And the Syrians were known for 2 things: their prowess in battle and their cruelty. So when God said wicked people, he meant wicked. And I apologize, this next part might get a little graphic, but one of the things that they were known for, was just the treatment of their enemies. They would skin people alive. They would impale their enemies on poles. One king took over a city and, talked about how he had killed 3,000 men and how, great he felt about this. And then he talked about how they brought all the prisoners, before him, and just apparently because the king was bored, he had his men cut off their ears, noses, hands, and their fingers. Not to kill them, just because they could. And that's who Jonah was told to go save. And so hearing that, it might make us understand a little bit more why Jonah was like, no, I am not going to talk to those guys. But as we know, he did. And he walked up to this city, which was called a great city. It was massive. It said it took 3 days to travel the whole city. And he went in and he started telling them, you have 40 days or God is going to wipe this city off the face of the planet. And after hearing what I just read, to our surprise, they listened. It says from the lowest person to the king himself. They all dressed themselves in sackcloth, the sign of mourning, and they went before God and they said, we are sorry. We will turn from our evil ways and we will follow you. And so Jonah went in and saved a people group that on paper couldn't have been saved. I mean, college ministry is looking pretty good right now. Rather than you telling me to go talk to these guys. They turned back from their evil ways and they pursued God, but only for about a generation. We see in later texts that they went back to their wicked ways and God did eventually destroy them. And so what Jesus is trying to make them understand is, I am greater than Jonah. Again, he says, just as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so will the Son of Man be to this generation. Just as Jonah was called to go into this group that had turned from God and say, you need to turn around and go back. He's saying, that is what I will be to this generation. Verse 31 says, the queen of the south will rise up with the men of this generation at the judgment and condemn them, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. He's saying, I know what you guys want, but you don't understand what I'm trying to give you. He's saying Jonah went in and he tried to change those people's lives, and he did, but it only worked for a short time. Jesus is trying to tell these people, I am greater than Jonah. This is going to continue on. Jesus knew that they wanted an earthly king. He was bringing them an eternal one. Here he references Solomon because he knew what the crowds wanted. They wanted their Messiah to come in on a white horse and just clean house. They wanted their Messiah to come in and just remove Rome, remove this earthly kingdom. And so when he references Solomon, he's bringing them back to a place where Israel was at its peak. When Solomon was king, they enjoyed ridiculous amounts of wealth. It was said that in Solomon's kingdom, that silver was worthless because they had so much gold. That's like me pulling out my wallet and saying, I can't fit these 20s in here because I have so many hundreds in here. They had impressive military power. Solomon made allies to his detriment with every kingdom that he could find. They had insane influence. Kings and queens and their advisors would travel from all over the world just to hear Solomon teach. They would come and sit at his feet just to hear his wisdom. And so when the Israelites are thinking of their Messiah, when they're thinking about the earthly kingdom, when they're thinking about, get us back there, Solomon is what comes to mind. But again, we see in verse 31 and 32, Jesus reminds them, Queen of the south will rise up with the men of this generation at the judgment and condemn them, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. He's saying, look, I know what you're thinking, but I have something better. So what can we take from this passage? When we look at it, what can we take from it? And it's this: God, or the gospel, has not lost its power. Jesus uses two extreme examples here. He's saying, look, you remember this prophet that went into the den of wickedness and changed people's lives, but only for a short time. You remember this king who lifted himself up to as high as you could get on the earth. I am greater than both of them. And thankfully for us, the gospel has not lost its power, guys. When we look at the state that our world is in, it doesn't take you very long to figure out it's pretty messed up. This was not God's original design. But thankfully, this isn't the only thing we have to look forward to. If we really want to see the world changed, The gospel is how you do it. The gospel is what changes people's lives. And I'm happy to say, just in our first year, we have already seen some of this life change happen. So this is my my student leadership team. I had to put 2 pictures up there because I don't actually have one that has all of them in it. And I'm still missing one because he's studying abroad in Japan right now. And so he won't be back with us until August. But the members of my leadership team are Joel, Lexi, Rachel, Parker, Emmons, David, and Ariel. There's some amazing young people. And just as I talked about with the relationship, having a Paul and a Timothy, these guys challenge me every single week. Again, these are students who saw the ministry and they said, I want to be involved in that. And we know in our ministry that it's the gospel that does the work. Between myself and the rest of my team, we've had over 60 meetings with different students this last year. And we got to share the gospel with them. And we had 2 that accepted Christ. One of them was a young lady who was attending a Bible study led by one of our female leaders. And she had grown up in the church. And she said, I heard the message many times. I went to youth group as a kid. But sitting in that Bible study, she said, I just looked around at the other girls and she's like, I don't have what they have. She's like, I couldn't put my finger on it. And so one week they came in and she was sitting there just beaming. And they said, what's going on? What happened? And she's like, guys, I accepted Christ. And this next semester, she's going to be discipled by one of our female leaders. The second one was a young man who went on a gospel appointment with one of our male leaders. And what we find most at GCU is not so much, I've never heard the gospel or I don't know who Jesus is. What we find more is when we ask people, are you a Christian? They say, yes. We say, cool, tell us your testimony. And they say, well, my parents took me to church. Well, I went to youth group a couple times. And we get to tell them, well, guys, that's not the same thing. And so in this meeting, one of our young men talked to this young man, and he got to tell him the gospel. And the church that this young man was raised in, he was taught a perverted version of the gospel where he was told at any moment, God can take your salvation because of sin that you commit. And so after hearing the gospel, the true gospel, he accepted Christ. And throughout the rest of the semester, he had to constantly get reassured because he just kept asking, he's like, are you sure? Are you sure Jesus can forgive me for this? And our leader got to tell him, yes. And that young man, after his one semester, decided that college wasn't for him. So he left. He was discipled last semester. But I'm so happy because in the one semester that he got to come, he got to hear the gospel. If you can't tell, I love my ministry. I love what we get to do. We took our students to an event that Christian Challenge puts on. Three times a year, we put on statewide events for all of our ministries. So here we did one called Surge, where the students got to go and just learn what true worship was. That it's not just singing songs, but it's devoting your life to God. From GCU, we took 24 students. We had just under 200 students come from all across the state. And I'm going to show you guys a video that I took while we were there, because it just impacted me so much. Hopefully it'll work. That was 200 students. 200 young people just praising our God. Sometimes we can forget the power of the gospel. Sometimes we can look at our world and say, there's nothing that could fix this. There's nothing that could change this. Guys, our God is alive. And the gospel has not lost its power. When Billy Graham was asked if he had any regrets about his ministry, he said, I only have one. I wish I had preached the gospel more. Because he said, that's where the power is. And we see in Matthew 28, Jesus calls his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. Sharing the gospel is not something that we just expect from people in ministry. It's not just something for pastors to do. It's not just something for people in the missions field to do. It's something that we're all called to. You may not feel like you have the gift of evangelism, and that's fine, but it still doesn't mean we're not called to do it. Again, in Fuel in the Flame, they have a passage that talks about the desire to see people come to Christ. And they write this: it is impossible to exaggerate the urgency of eternity. No effort we make to share Christ with lost people is overkill. Charles Spurgeon put it this way: if there existed only one man or woman who did not love the Savior, and if that person lived among the wilds of Siberia, and if it were necessary that all the millions of believers on the face of the earth should journey there and every one of them plead with him to come to Jesus before he could be converted, it would be well worth all the zeal, all the labor, the expense. If we had to preach to thousands years after years and never reached but one soul, that one soul would be full reward for all our labor. For a soul is of countless price. I love the gospel, guys. It is the only thing that changes people's lives for good. We can have momentary changes, but it is the only thing that will truly change someone's life. So all the silly events that we do, all the game nights, all the whatever we do on our campus, I always try to remind my students, guys, we are here for one reason. And that is to point people back to him. And if I can encourage you guys, try to look for those opportunities. Look for those opportunities to share the gospel. Studies have found that most people, it takes 7 presentations of the gospel for them to accept Christ. You never know if you're number 1 or if you're number 7. If you guys would like to keep up on our ministry, we send out a newsletter 3 times a year. It's a physical newsletter. We have a sign-up sheet in the back. You just need your name, your address, and the only thing you're going to get is from us. My wife and I fold them and put them in envelopes ourselves. You're not going to get any spam or anything like that, at least on our end. But if you're also hearing this and you're going, I want to be involved in this, but I can't go to a college campus, we do still need financial support. If that's something you're feeling called to, please come talk to me in the back. I'll be back there if any of you want to talk about any aspect of the ministry. I'd love to. You don't have to be a supporter to sign up for our newsletter. We do that for free. Thank you guys for having me here today.